class of 67. I want to welcome you to the fourth in our series of class webinars. I hope you and your family are well. On the screen today with me are Tom Amato, whom you know, class vice president. He's chair of the virtual mini reunion committee, and he's become the Zoom czar. He will talk with you about logistics of this call in just a second. Also on the screen is our classmate, Frank Upham. Frank is a law professor at NYU who focuses on Asian law, and he's going to be the moderator for today. And finally, our guest for today, Princeton professor Rory Truex, class of '07. For those of you who were not math majors, that means he graduated at our 40th reunion. If you didn't feel old before this started. The only negative thing that I can find on his record is that he got his PhD from Yale. Other than that,
I didn't get into Princeton.
It's a pretty good record. These webinars and the other class activities we're doing these days are a team effort. And we do that to maintain the camaraderie of the class, especially in these times. And every one of these, I thank our team intentionally because this class is truly a team effort. First, thanks to Dave Martin. Dave Martin is chair of the mini reunion committee, and he's quite a leader. And thanks to Tom and his virtual mini reunion committee, which includes Dick Fiss, Galen Aoki, and John Armstrong on the web, Peter Holzer, Ken Logan, Bob Mayer, Sadler Poe, and Frank Strasburger. Thinking about Dave Martin and Dick Fiss reminds me that under Dave's leadership, Dick Fiss has just finished a monumental effort to organize class camaraderie on a regional and affinity group basis. This is going to be launched soon, and this is going to facilitate people getting together in smaller groups. I heartily recommend it. I had a great Zoom with my roommates last week. It seems like the conversation started about a week after we left Gauss Hall a few decades ago. I commend them to you. Also mentioning Sadler Poe, he along with Marty Eichelberger are the class annual giving czars. And it reminds me how great it was to see our class participation rates. In my view, participation reflects the class. One of the things that makes us the mighty class is our participation and our enthusiasm and camaraderie. So I urge you to participate. There are only a few weeks left. And last, I want to thank Professor Truex for agreeing to talk with us today. We're honored to have him. Thank you all for attending. Tom, turning it over to you.
Okay, for those experts that have been with us for a number of these webinars, the format is going to be a webinar, which means you can ask questions and chat online, but you will not be able to speak, only the panelists will. We will have a period of time, probably 45 minutes, where it will be a panel, and Frank will do the Q&A with Professor Truex. Afterwards, in a new format, we are opening up a precept. If those of you that wish to stay and have more of a dialogue with the professor, we will have a format for that. In between, we will do a quick poll, and when the poll pops up towards the end of our regular time, move it to the side so it doesn't distract, but we really appreciate your feedback on these sessions. With that, I'll turn it over to Frank.
Thank you very much, Tom and Dick, and thanks very much to Professor Truex, and I hope he won't mind if I refer to you as Rory. Is that all right?
That would be great. Thank you.
Okay. Professor, we're extremely fortunate to have Rory with us, and not just because of the topic, which is extremely important, but because I did a little advanced research and watched a couple of lectures by Rory. And one of the things that I was reassured by was that he was very informal and very open to the audience. Now, there was an audience at the ones that I saw, but there's an audience here too, for those of you who have done this stuff at Zoom. It's as somebody who's looking, I was gonna say looking forward, but looking toward maybe better, having to teach in Zoom, I was been reassured by how much we can learn through Zoom. Rory, as Dick already said, Rory is a Princeton graduate. He's an assistant professor at the Woodrow Wilson School, where he specializes in Chinese politics. But what his dissertation and at least one of his emphases is on the question of authoritarian politics. China poses a number of, I don't want to use threat because I think there's no reason for the United States and China to be deadly enemies. But China poses some threats to conventional wisdom of Western scholarship. One of them is economic growth, which China has done better than, and Rory can correct me, better than any other human society in history. And it's done so without the kind of legal machinery that Western scholars have always assumed was necessary. But what I think Rory can really address here is, because the legal system is not only about commercial and economic growth, it's also about being responsive to populations. And you can see that in a legal system in the United States, which is constantly responding to its population, or Japan or Taiwan. It's hard to see the legal system playing that role in China. One possible substitute for that is the National People's Congress, which is, Rory is, I think, at least to my knowledge, the world's leading expert, at least in the English language, on the National People's Congress. So I will have a couple of questions after this. That I didn't actually make that a condition of my being the moderator, but it's too late for Tom or Dick to change that now. But I'm also drawing on classmates who've already written me questions. So Rory, if you would take it away, I'd appreciate it. And thank you for doing this.
Thank you for the introduction, Frank. Can everybody hear me okay? Can I get a thumbs up if everyone can hear me? All right, good. So I just start by saying, so yeah, we are Reunions buddies. We're 40 years apart. So hopefully one day when Reunions is back, I will join you at the tent and we can meet in person and have a beer. And the other thing I wanted to say, you know, this talk, of course, will be about China and both domestic politics in China and US-China relations. But for those interested, I am happy to talk about how Princeton is responding to COVID and some of the developments there. I've been involved in a couple of committees about reopening the university and so forth. So I don't know if you're wondering more about what's going on or students or these sorts of things, but if we want to bracket a few minutes at the end, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about what Princeton's like at the moment. So I wanted to start just with a quick observation that US-China relations are sort of in free fall right now. And just when you think it can't get any worse, it does. And the coronavirus outbreak has accelerated a shift in distrust between the two countries. And recent events in Hong Kong, where we are learning that the government in Beijing is passing legislation that would further erode the autonomy of Hong Kong, that's going to also accelerate deterioration. And so the question is this deterioration productive for the United States? What are the forces behind this deterioration, and will it likely shift if we do have a new administration in January? And to answer those questions, I actually wanted to start on the Chinese side, because so much of what we talk about in Western media is about, well, what's going on with President Trump and so forth, but we often forget that China is changing, and China is changing quite rapidly. And so I want to talk a little bit about what are the major shifts that we're seeing in the Chinese political system in the last 5 to 7 years, and what are the implications for how China behaves in its foreign policy and how that will affect US-China relations. So I would start by saying that for a long time, we viewed the Chinese Communist Party as a sort of exceptional regime. And most authoritarian regimes don't last very long. The Chinese Communist Party is an authoritarian regime, and most dictators don't stay in office that long. They tend to fall from one of two reasons. The first, and actually the most common, is they fall from within. So about 60 to 70% of dictatorships fall via coup d'etat. So some other member of the elite circles of a ruling regime like the Communist Party will make a power play, and that will unravel the regime itself. And the second reason they fall is, of course, revolution, the kind of romantic version of regime change where citizens march to the square and demand democracy or some other form of political change. And so China, the Chinese Communist Party, has been in power since 1949. It is now, I believe, the longest running authoritarian regime. Maybe North Korea would be slightly longer, but it's defying expectations. And the reason why it's defying expectations, we tend to point to two different systems that are going on. The first, the problem of coup d'etats and elite instability, the Chinese Communist Party was unique in the creation of what we would call power-sharing institutions. So elite leaders of the Chinese Communist Party figured out, in contrast to the Mao era, in the post-Mao era, elite members of the Chinese Communist Party basically figured out how to play nice with each other. So institutions were put in place such that no one leader would become too powerful. A number of leaders would share power, each have their own portfolio of different governance issues. There would be retirement ages such that people would leave office and there'd be a rotation of power and authority. And if you made it to the elite levels of the Communist Party, you were sort of safe. You wouldn't be purged, you wouldn't face any real form of violence. And then the second key innovation of the Communist Party, again, if we think about fear of revolution and the threat of revolution, the Communist Party, at least in the 2000s, had what we would call a rich set of input institutions. So it wasn't, of course, a democracy, and anybody who uses that word to describe China is way off. But it had a number of institutions in place that would allow normal citizens to voice their grievances to the government and in turn be responded. So this image of China as this sort of hyper-repressive state, in my opinion, has always been a little bit off. And in fact, there's a lot of different ways that Chinese citizens can voice their opinions to the government and be heard without actually being able to vote and select their leaders. So that was how we used to view China. And there's a famous piece, if you're looking for a reading, there's a famous piece by Andrew Nathan, who's a professor at Columbia, called Authoritarian Resilience. And it basically goes through this argument in greater detail. That piece was published in 2002. Now, if we had to fast forward to today, what we've observed in the last basically 8 years under Xi Jinping has been a rapid erosion of both of those things. And what argument I would make today is that one of the reasons why US-China relations are deteriorating is because China is changing quite quickly, and it is changing in a direction that is more authoritarian, more repressive, more focused on one central leader in Xi Jinping. And so even people like myself who are relatively moderate on China and would be inclined to support policies that are more towards engagement, less towards containment, Cold War thinking, even folks like myself have found it more difficult to make that argument given what we're observing in China. So I just want to spend just a couple of minutes kind of describing what Xi Jinping is all about. And I think there's 3 words that come to mind, which we would, I think China observers would agree, which is that he's a nationalist, he's a populist, and he's authoritarian to his core. So on the nationalism front, what we've observed is that one of the core features of Xi Jinping's leadership has been the realization of what is known as the China dream or the Chinese dream, depending on how you translate it. The China dream, 中国梦 in Chinese, is basically the idea that China was once a great nation and the Communist Party has allowed it to stand up and will lead its rejuvenation. So it is a collective dream. It is not about individual betterment. It is about the nation. And the role of the individual in this is subservient to the nation. The the Chinese university students are actually taught, I'm doing a study of Chinese university textbooks, and they're actually taught that the meaning of life is to advance China. That is a life well lived in China today, is to advance the nation. And because the Chinese Communist Party is described as the protector of the nation and Xi Jinping as the head of the Chinese Communist Party, you can connect all the dots. And so a life well lived, according to the Communist Party, is a life that serves the party and serves the nation. And so that rhetoric is quite strong, and it appears all over China, including billboards, propaganda campaigns, and so forth. And it's reflected in foreign policy and domestic policy. So a lot of the hardline stance that we've observed on Hong Kong, for example, is in some sense an issue of national sovereignty, national pride. Similarly for Xinjiang, which we should talk about hopefully at some point, Xinjiang is a province, a region in Western China where the Communist Party has undertaken mass re-education of anywhere from a few 100,000 to a couple million ethnic Muslims, the Uyghur population. Again, that is described in nationalist terms. The Communist Party is supposed to be purportedly bringing that population into the Chinese nation, but of course, it's much, much darker than that. So he's a nationalist. He's also a populist, and on the populist front, the key thing that he has done has cracked down on corruption. So under Xi Jinping, the old elite bargain, which was that if you're a high-level Communist Party member, you're safe, that bargain is out the window. We've seen hundreds of thousands of officials investigated for graft, embezzlement, and corruption, including what are known as tigers in the Chinese system, which are elite officials. The common perception of this campaign is that this is a mechanism for Xi Jinping to consolidate power and remove his enemies. And there is a little bit of truth to that. I would say the Communist Party operates a little bit like a criminal gang. You often hear, sociologists talk about criminal gangs in the US, and oftentimes they force their members to commit a heinous crime early. And that by committing that crime, it binds them all together. So we're all guilty, therefore we're all in this together. So you could argue that corruption in China, pretty much everybody who's anybody in the Communist Party could be found guilty of corruption. They've all done enough, in my opinion, that they could be taken down, including Xi Jinping himself. So that was sort of the glue that bound the regime together. But it really impacted legitimacy, and the number one issue for Chinese citizens on public opinion surveys about the party was always about corruption. And so Xi Jinping has characterized himself as clean, virtuous, and he's going to rid the party of corruption. And then the final thing I would say is he's authoritarian through and through, and all Communist Party leaders are authoritarian, but Xi Jinping in particular has relied on kind of the good old dictator toolkit of repression and coercion and censorship and indoctrination. So under Xi, we've observed a crackdown on civil society actors, in particular lawyers, NGOs, and feminists, including foreign NGOs and academics. And so the level of repression in China today, I would argue, is higher than we've seen since 1989 and the post-Tiananmen period. And the final reason he's authoritarian is he's also taken great pains to foster a cult of personality around himself, which we haven't seen for decades. So what is the sum of all of these things is that we've seen a change in China. China today is not, when I started visiting China in the 2000s, China today is not like it was then. And many people who are rooting for political reform, or at least some liberalization in China, are very disappointed and pessimistic about the future. And this is alarming because what do we know about this governance? Forget authoritarian politics. We know that what we're observing in China, where we have one leader centralizing power, removing his rivals, it begets a certain yes man politics. So that would be one trend I would watch, and one trend that is alarming in China today is that there's really no opposition whatsoever to Xi Jinping at the elite level. And for that reason, he was able, you might have known that he was able to get rid of term limits for his position of the presidency. So it suggests he might be able to stay on in office even longer. And so we know from Chinese history that when you have one leader that has too much power and a large cult of responsibility, personality, that things can go awry really quickly. And so I am alarmed at the direction that China is taking. So I do want to open it up to questions. I would just close by saying, well, what are the implications of this for US-China relations? I think what we're observing is basically a spiral of hardliner dominance, which is that all the things that are happening in China, the crackdown in Xinjiang, what's going on in Hong Kong, these cults of personality, all of that allows people who are hawkish on it to say, look, this is a government that is evil. This is our mortal enemy. They pose an existential threat to the United States. And people that are moderate, there's not much of a leg to stand on right now. It's difficult to defend a regime that is throwing 1 million Muslims in what can be labeled as concentration camps. And then on the Chinese side, they're observing what's happening in the United States, and they're looking at what the Trump administration is doing, and especially the language about containing China or stopping China's rise. And that plays into hawkish hardliner arguments within the Chinese Communist Party, which have long held that the US is trying to hurt China and prevent its rise. And so now you have hardliners on both sides that are dominating the discourse, and there isn't much room for compromise or cooperation. And we can talk more about, is that a good thing or a bad thing for the United States? It's pretty clear with the outbreak of COVID-19 that a world in which the US government and the Chinese government are civil and can cooperate, material effects out for us all. And in this case, of course, health, we can imagine that the global response to COVID-19 would be better, for better US-China relations. But everything from the environment, nuclear non-proliferation, and so forth, I think do require at least a cordial relationship between the US and China. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to talk really about anything going on domestic China, but also US-China relations. And another topic that I did want to bracket in hopes that we have time is the effect of China on universities, and including Princeton, and how do we navigate dealing with a country that is powerful and has high human capital, but is also hostile to academic freedom. That's an issue that Princeton is confronting, and so I'm happy to talk more about that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rory. I'll pick up right where you ended, since this is the one question that I actually gave you a heads up on. About 2 weeks ago or so, there was a very long article in the Harvard Crimson, which is the student newspaper, which was something like the end of the Harvard century, which I thought was fairly arrogant. But part of it was about China. And it described an incident in 2015 where a dissident lawyer called Teng Biao and another dissident, often called a blind lawyer, although he is blind, but he's not a lawyer, Cheng Guangcheng, were going to have a panel at, I guess, Harvard Law School. And the then president of Princeton, Drew Faust, was in Beijing at the time. And a Harvard law professor went to Teng Biao and said, please postpone your panel. Although it was put as postponement, the panel was never held. And this was not reported until 5 years later, came out in this Crimson article. A Harvard law professor then, the next week after the Crimson article, said, yes, I asked Teng Biao not to have the panel. And I did it, and somewhere in my many notes, since I haven't figured out how to have my computerized notes up while I'm Zooming, I have ones on paper and I've forgotten how to work with paper. But the Harvard law professor said, yes, I told him to not do the panel because I was worried about all the Harvard activities in China. Now, he didn't mention it, but I assume one of those activities that President Faust was engaged in was fundraising, since China is a rich source of money for American universities, as Rory pointed out in his Atlantic article, which was assigned, and I hope you all read it. And so I'm wondering, this was, to me, naive as I am, shocking. And I would just love to get Rory's response on two levels. It was shocking to me that Teng Biao would be asked not to have this panel, although, of course, the way Harvard Law School should have handled it is not to have him do the panel while the president was in China. But it was also shocking to me that I'm involved in the Asian law community, which is on the China side overwhelmingly dominated by people who want China to have human rights similar to the United States. And I was shocked by the lack of reaction to this revelation that Harvard had done what seems to me would not be called, to use Rory's language from the Atlantic article, a freedom of speech operation. So I was just wondering, Rory, if you could give us your reaction to that.
I think it's a great question. And I would say, universities confront the same decision that basically any actor engaging with China has to right now, which is that China is powerful and is in a position where it has some leverage. And in order to get access to China, institutions, universities, firms, newspapers are faced with the decision of, do I play by the party's rules and potentially self-censor on an important issue in order to preserve access, or do I stick to my guns and potentially lose access? And that calculation is affecting Harvard. It's affecting the Houston Rockets. I don't know if any of you followed what happened with Daryl Morey. It's affecting American Airlines, which have been asked to change the language about Taiwan on their websites. It's infecting individual journalists. It's now the New York Times and the Washington Post are banned from China. All journalists have left. Whereas Bloomberg, I believe, is still there because Bloomberg has a terminal business and their China coverage is a little bit less critical. And so they're allowed to stay. Individual academics like myself, Andrew Nathan, the person who wrote Authoritarian Resilience, is banned from China because he's been very critical. And so everybody's navigating this weird ethical space. And I would say the first thing we always need to do is be careful not to blame the victim. In the end, we have an emerging superpower that's taking issue with a tweet by an MBA GM or a meeting on campus with a Chinese dissident. And I think we should be pointing blame at the Chinese government first for these types of issues. And then we can think about, should Harvard acted differently, or should, the Houston Rockets or the NBA have acted differently given the conditions they were facing. That's the first thing I would say. I think often we focus on, the Western actor should have done more to stand up to China, when we forget that it's really the Chinese government that is putting people in these absurd situations. The second thing I would say about the Harvard issue is, I think the reason why Frank, you mentioned there wasn't that much discussion. I think it's because I think there is a degree of this going on among universities. I think they have to play the game. I think no world-class university can be boxed out of China. And many of them have campuses in China, or major research centers or major fixed capital investments. And that does create an incentive to self-censor or to be careful around these sorts of things. I would say Princeton's approach, which I admire, has long been, do not have a major fixed capital investment in China. We have no campus there. We have the Princeton and Beijing program, but that's a very nimble program. We have a China Center, which is basically one office in the middle of a call center on the back lot of Tsinghua University. So it's a nothing. Whereas you look at Stanford has a multi-million-dollar center at Peking University. So Princeton's approach, which I admire, has long been to have a light footprint in China. I think, and that gives it a little bit more flexibility. And then the final thing I would say is that, we often focus, the story you mentioned about Teng Biao is an important one, but we often focus on that type of story and we don't focus on all the other times where universities really stand up for activists, human rights lawyers, and dissidents. And again, Princeton in particular has a history of this. So following Tiananmen Square, a lot of Chinese student activists fled, and many of them, the most famous leader was Chai Ling, who's a young woman. She did her master's at the Woodrow Wilson School, and Princeton brought her in. To this day, there's actually a major Chinese dissident community in Princeton. Teng Biao lives in Westward, because the university has traditionally helped them. And it's not just Princeton, NYU in particular has done a lot for Chung Guangcheng and other dissidents. So I think it's important, you know, it's a balance. They're trying to play this middle road, and it's important to see both sides. But I've raised this issue at various times with Princeton, and it's also important to remember that universities are not human rights organizations. And they've said that to me, not Princeton, you know, nobody powerful, but I've learned this policy, which is that they tend to avoid taking stances on political issues or human rights issues. If it's related to academic freedom, they will take a stronger stance. And so, yeah, I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but that's sort of some.
It's a great answer, Roy, but I'm going to add something to it.
Please do.
When NYU, when Chung Guangcheng, the blind dissident known as a lawyer, but not really a lawyer, came to NYU, I spent the summer teaching him American constitutional law in Chinese. This is somebody who had never, I don't think he graduated from high school. A very smart guy, but not a very attractive personality. The only thing I would add to what Rory said is about universities, and I tried to put my description of the Harvard thing in a non-judgmental way, because I share Rory's, I mean, the only thing, yeah, China is powerful. And the other thing I would add about the power is the tuition flow. Those of you who are not have the pleasure of being lawyers, there's a one-year postgraduate program called the LLM, or Masters in Law, that is that most American law schools have, and it's overwhelmingly foreign. And over the last 40 years, Chinese students have become a plurality, a large plurality. And I would like to think that that's certainly true for NYU. I'd like to think that we have never, ever compromised anything. I can't believe that's true. I just hope we've done it skillfully. So I now want to turn to another question that was sort of an amalgam of several questions that our classmates have sent in. How should the U.S. react to something like the security law that is now before the National People's Congress? Steve Bannon has said that the United States is already at war with China. Others have indicated that we're in a, as I think you said, a kind of confrontational relationship that can't be cooperative. But even if you take a more moderate stance, as I believe you do, what can the U.S. do? The U.S. universities, as you said, have been, I would say, focused almost exclusively on human rights in China, Ford Foundation, Human Rights Watch, all these. That doesn't seem to be working. Almost all of them have withdrawn from China. But what should the US do in response to something like Hong Kong? Or in my sense, the Uyghur situation is even worse than the Hong Kong one. What can the US do?
So I think my answer to that would be, first, there's a recognition probably that we can't do as much as we would like. And I am quite pessimistic about the future of Hong Kong. And I think there's very little stopping the Chinese Communist Party from continuing to encroach on the freedom of the Hong Kong people. And I don't think there's that much we can do. I don't think it's something that the US would be willing to go to war over, nor should we. And so short of some sanctions here and there, I don't see much that we can do that would actively deter what's going on. I would say that what I would have liked to see in the last few years is sort of very clear, full-throated defense over time from the president of the freedom of the Hong Kong people. And we haven't seen that. So President Trump has been oddly reticent to talk about Hong Kong. There was some discussion that he was willing to stay mum on Hong Kong in order to advance the trade negotiation. And so this is a repeated pattern where human rights and democracy concerns have been subservient to economic concerns. We haven't also had a very strong stance on the Xinjiang issue. And in my mind, they should be different, right? So we should be simultaneously willing to negotiate with China on soybeans, but also willing to criticize China's human rights record. So I would have liked to see more consistent, full-throated criticism of the major human rights abuses that have been going on, particularly Xinjiang, which you mentioned, which I think we've missed the opportunity. President Trump is not a president that strikes me as particularly interested in the human rights of Muslims in Western China. And I don't mean to bring my own politics into this, but on the terms of the China issue, I would say this has been a missed opportunity because another approach that maybe would have been more helpful than what we're currently doing would have been a real multilateral effort in concert with other Western governments about this issue, such that the Chinese Communist Party faces a very clear, if we do this, there will be a concerted effort, not just by the US, but also by Canada, the UK, all of our allies in NATO, to some of these issues. But again, this is a president that is generally reluctant to work in a multilateral fashion. And so that means that our own deterrent isn't quite there. And then the final thing I would say is sometimes there's a tendency, the China issue is it's one of the only things in DC that unites people. So both people on the left and the right, it's in fashion to be anti-China. And in some sense, it's almost a contest right now to see who can be more tough on China. And that has electoral benefits. And that's what we're seeing in the presidential election. So Biden and Trump will both be trying to convince everybody that they're the toughest with respect to China. And that plays into American public opinion. American public opinion about China is at an all-time low. So if I were trying to win the office of the presidency, I would be tough on China too. But there's sort of smart tough, and then there's sort of non-strategic bluster. And I think we're getting a little bit of that. And just to give you an example, so in response to some of the Hong Kong protests, the Congress passed what's known as the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. And one of the key provisions of that act is that the State Department will review Hong Kong's status and autonomy from mainland China every year. And if it decides that Hong Kong is no longer sufficiently autonomous, it will remove Hong Kong's special trade relationship with the United States. That's it. That's the main stick we have to counter what Beijing is doing right now. Guess what? If we do that, that will hurt the people of Hong Kong. It will have really no tangible impact on China's economic growth, but it will really hurt the people of Hong Kong. So precisely the people that we're trying to help, it will hurt them. And not only that, Beijing will probably gain legitimacy because it will be viewed as an infringement on their sovereignty. So people have been, very supportive of this particular piece of legislation. And I, for one, have never really wrapped my head around what it's supposed to do. But I think, if it were me, I would say multilateralism, things that matter to China. There's an upcoming Olympics in China. What if we work with our allies to say, arrange an Olympic boycott if this continues, if the things that are happening in Xinjiang and Hong Kong continue? Those sorts of symbolic things I think might matter to China a little bit more. And I think that requires a little bit more planning and cooperation and coordination than we're currently seeing.
We've got a bunch of excellent questions. I'll try to amalgamate another one. Several people have brought up linking the status of Hong Kong to the status of Taiwan. And President Tsai of Taiwan has just been reelected. She's known as somewhat more aggressive towards Taiwan independence than previous regimes there. And so one group of people would like to have you, and including me, would like to have you address Taiwan and its status. I would like to just say that in terms of what Rory said about anti-Chinese stuff in the election, it's one thing to be anti-Chinese, it's one thing to be racist towards Asians and Asian Americans in the United States. And I have had several instances of students of mine, some of whom, some are actually Chinese citizens, some are Chinese Americans, some are Vietnamese, among all kinds of racist incidents, even in places like Los Angeles and New York. So I just want to add that in. But Taiwan, and another question which I like particularly because it's something that I was thinking of, how would you put, I'm old enough to remember when Japan was China. In other words, oh my God, Japan, 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 right? Japan now, third largest economy in the world, one of the world's most successful society. Most Americans, think of it about as often as they do Bulgaria. Do you think China will pass to 20 years ago, 20 years from now, will we still be, my God, China?
Okay, so those are two great questions. So on the Taiwan issue, I think just a couple points that are worth making is that, so there are a group of people in mainland China that believe that Taiwan can be, quote, lured back under the one country, two systems model, which is that Taiwan is part of China, is under the national jurisdiction of Beijing, but retains a significant amount of political and economic autonomy.
And military.
And military. And their argument is that, Taiwan has been marginalized economically, and the lure of the economic growth in the mainland will shift public opinion in Taiwan such that people want to reunify. This is a fantasy. And it shows, I think, how little they've understood Taiwanese politics. And in particular, with what we've observed in Hong Kong, there is really no political appetite, at least among the majority of residents of Taiwan, for a reunification with China. So the best that can be hoped for with Taiwan is a preservation of the status quo. There is no world, occasionally you hear US policymakers say, oh, we should recognize Taiwan diplomatically or push for Taiwanese independence or Hong Kong independence. That is a very, very, very dangerous viewpoint, and that would beget a military conflict with China if that were to become anywhere close to the stance of the US government. So the reality is Taiwan is stuck in no man's land, stuck in limbo, and that's the best it can hope for. The question is, will what's going on in Hong Kong embolden Xi Jinping or whoever succeeds him to do something more aggressive and potentially intervene militarily? I am not a military expert, but what I've heard is that it is, increasingly the balance of power is shifting towards China in this calculation. And would the US military intervene to protect Taiwan and risk a war with China? On paper, that's what we say we would do. But there's always this question of would that actually happen? And I think what's protecting Taiwan now is actually not so much the US, it's really just the calculation. If I'm Xi Jinping, why would I try to take Taiwan? It's a huge risk, right? We could lose or we could win, and then we'd have to govern Taiwan, in which there would be an insurrection. Not only that, there will be global military pushback. So I think just the domestic politics here, I don't see a world in which it makes sense for Xi Jinping to try to intervene militarily in Taiwan, because I think in some sense the current equilibrium is convenient for him and for the party, which is they say, oh, look at the US, they're preventing us from reunifying with Taiwan, and that allows them to rile up nationalism and everything. So I'm more optimistic than most that Taiwan will continue to just sort of float along. But I'm not a Taiwan expert, so maybe I shouldn't have even answered that question to begin with.
Too late now, Rory.
Too late now. I hope and this is being recorded too, my God. Okay, yeah. So then the second thing, so will we think of China as Japan? I think a lot of it honestly depends on politics, and in particular the politics of mainland China. I mean, India is rising, Brazil is rising, but we never, nobody's got much antipathy towards either of those places. I mean, the reason why there's a fear of China is because it's authoritarian. It's because it's presenting a political system different than our own. If China were democratic, I think we would welcome its rise. We would welcome its its growth, and it would be easier to embed it in international institutions. And so I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's a political system that's different than our own. And then I would also say that a lot of the rhetoric about there, you hear the phrase new Cold War is being thrown around more in the last 2 months than I've heard it in the last 10 years. I think it's politically convenient. I think US politicians realize that fear-mongering and warmongering are helpful to get reelected. Nobody wants to be perceived as soft on China, and people like to have an enemy. That's the honest truth. And so I think for that reason, in US politics, I don't see a lot of space for a more cooperative engagement approach with China. Maybe that would change if China changes. So I think a lot of it is contingent on what happens in China. I'm not personally very optimistic that we're going to see democratization in China in the next 10 to 30 years. There's a cottage industry of Western experts that have been predicting Chinese democratization for 30 years, and they've been wrong. So I think
I've been sort of one of them, having lived in Taiwan for 2 years when it was a Leninist regime. I thought, oh, Taiwan, South Korea, they became democratic. It's just a matter of time with China.
And maybe it is. And what do we know about revolution and regime change is that it's usually unpredictable. And so nobody saw the fall of the Berlin Wall coming. And so, I think, who knows? But I think a lot of it really depends on how China's own political system evolves and whether or not that will change American public opinion.
Frank, I'm going to take.
There are a couple of questions here that I think apply.
Yes, I was about to say somebody else should, because I can't watch Rory and read all these excellent questions.
Well, there's one that I think both of you, there are a couple that are related. I think that both of you could answer because they cover in some way both of your layers of expertise. One's from Mark Bitterman, who says, how can we deal with China when they abrogate agreements like the Hong Kong agreement that they signed with Great Britain? How can we trust them? This also relates to how can we trust them on intellectual property issues? And a question from Jim Edmondson saying, do you see risk in Hong Kong no longer being the financial centrality in the world? That also kind of relates to the rule of law, the ability to trust them, et cetera. What are your reactions to kind of that financial and legal aspect of the relationship and how it seems to be changing?
Frank, would you want to answer?
Oh, no. You, Roy. I will pick and choose things that you say to make me look good. But
all right. How can we trust them? I mean, I think it's important to know that a lot of the issues that are the sticking points in the U.S.-China relationship preceded President Trump, and I think would have been brought to the fore in some shape or form with the Clinton administration, or will likely continue to be brought to the fore if Biden gets elected in a few months. And I think trust is a big part of the issue, and I think there's a general sentiment among U.S. policymakers that China isn't playing by the rules. And an example of this that I would be more familiar with would be economic and academic espionage. So there is evidence that on university campuses or among American tech firms, that the Chinese government is conducting a coordinated espionage campaign with non-traditional collectors, including students, graduate students, faculty members, and so forth, to collect information that is not necessarily military, but it's actually economic. So they're stealing trade secrets, intellectual property, and then transferring it to Chinese companies to give them a competitive edge. And of course, all countries engage in espionage. The US certainly engages in espionage, but we do not, I believe, I'm not in the intelligence community, but we do not have a policy of engaging in economic espionage. And so that's the sort of thing that is and should be a sticking point in the relationship. Similarly, what they're doing in Hong Kong, they would argue that that is a domestic issue, not really an issue with the British government. But there is a sort of repeated pattern of behavior where they are bending or not playing by the rules. And I think this is something that, again, just needs to be called. They're only going to play by the rules when it's in their incentive to do so, right? And it should be noted that the US also doesn't always play by the rules and is willing to buck international law in the UN when it has its own security interests. So that's sort of how great powers behave. And so China is increasingly behaving like a great power that sort of makes its own rules. But I would say the only way we can work to trust them is if we create institutions in place that will encourage them to play by the rules. And for that reason, like the trade negotiation, I don't know a whole lot about the trade war. That's I just don't know a lot about soybeans and quotas and these sorts of things. But the one I have heard that a lot of the intellectual property guarantees that are included in the trade negotiation, those have potential to really change things in China. So I think there is room for cooperation here. I just think it takes a whole lot of naming and shaming from the international community. On the status of Hong Kong, I think, Hong Kong already isn't, put aside all the political unrest in the last 2 years, Hong Kong already is declining in its status relative to other Chinese cities. It used to be, certainly in the 1970s and 80s, the gateway to China, the gateway to East Asia, and capital flowed through Hong Kong. And it was sort of a go-between for foreigners to interface with Chinese counterparts. Now, in any mainland Chinese city, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Beijing is just as cosmopolitan as Hong Kong. The English is probably not quite as good, but good enough. And so there's no need for the Chinese government. It doesn't quite need Hong Kong to attract foreign capital the way it did. And what you hear is that the political unrest in the last year or two has accelerated the decline of Hong Kong. And in its place, you're going to see other cities, namely Shanghai and Shenzhen, continue to occupy that space. So I am very pessimistic about the future of Hong Kong, but I don't think the Chinese government has much of an issue with seeing Hong Kong's status decline and a city in the mainland take its place. I don't think that's something that's particularly costly to them. I think it's probably actually welcome to them. But I will let Frank.
I would just comment on what Rory said about playing by the rules, and specifically on intellectual property. The United States in the 19th century, when it was a developing country, had a systematic policy of not recognizing British patents and consistently stole intellectual property from the UK, maybe other parts of Europe too. When I lived in Taiwan in 1967 and 1969, Taiwan was awash in pirated intellectual property. I think what happens, and I think this is relevant to Rory's comment about the current deal, possible trade deal, when a country becomes developed and starts to produce its own intellectual property, which China is certainly doing now, then it will be much more interested in protecting intellectual property. It happened to the United States, it happened in Taiwan. I think it'll probably happen in China as well. I have lots more questions, but Dick, have you amalgamated any other questions here, or Tom?
Yeah, I'd like to ask a personal question and also launch the poll that kind of bridges this transition. You've talked about democratic activities within an authoritarian regime as an area of study. And I've also observed the Chinese being brilliant in creating a political power or influence by going to third world countries and garnering up relationships and votes that work in the United Nations and other activities, infrastructure investments, ports, roads, etc. The ability of the regime to work in the world of democracy while retaining authoritarian control is brilliant. They seem to be doing that quite well. Is that a strategy that is unique to this period, or is that part of what happens in this kind of regime?
I think that's a good question. I would just say a couple things on that point. The first is that, people often talk about the China model. And I think that question inherently, the question of what is the China model, is it trying to export its model of governance? That's sort of our natural question because we're coming from a frame of the Cold War and the Soviet Union trying to export its political and economic system. I think the evidence that China is trying to actively convert other countries to its form of government is still relatively weak. I think it engages in technical advising. So you will hear of bureaucrats from Ethiopia going to visit Beijing to learn from the Central Party School about, I don't know, food safety. So it's doing a lot of technical capacity building in the developing world. That's not quite the same as saying, hey guys, you need to have one party and you need to, have a great fire. Like, I don't think they're quite exporting their political model. And I think we need to be, we're in the same, the US is, right? So we are actively engaged in democracy in the world. So I think we need to just make sure that we're not overestimating what they're doing. The one thing that I am observing that is alarming is China, the Chinese Communist Party, is sort of the market leader in digital surveillance and what we would call techno-authoritarianism. So using the internet, not just the internet in China, people used to say this is going to be what democratizes China. In fact, it's gone completely opposite direction. And the Communist Party is very astute at managing social media, managing internet use, not just to stem off threats, but to actually enhance their rule. And what we're observing is that those tools, like the technology behind things like the Great Firewall, which prevents Chinese citizens from accessing websites, that is now popping up potentially in other countries. And so there is sort of this China's model of the internet, where the internet has borders. We used to think the internet will be borderless and a global thing. It's has borders now, and I think China's version of the internet is being spread to other authoritarian countries. And so I think that's sort of how they're operating. The last thing I would say on democracy, just to clarify, often we do view the Chinese government as, okay, it's authoritarian. Sometimes people use the word totalitarian, which I think is an incorrect use of that term. But it is also important to see that it's not monolithic, and at the same time, when it can be taking a more repressive or authoritarian turn, other parts of the government can be liberalizing. So to give an example of this, the court system, the Chinese court system now posts all of its cases online. So beginning in 2014, the Supreme People's Court required all lower level courts to upload their case files to a central website. So there's now 80 million court cases online. And those cases are free for lawyers to look at, citizens to look at, people like me to download and analyze. That would have been unthinkable 10 or 20 years ago. And it is a development, it's a trend in the right direction. It's a move to increase transparency and legitimacy of the court system. So I think it's sometimes that type of story, like I haven't seen a New York Times piece about how China's court system is actually maybe getting a little bit better, but it's important that we keep that balance in mind.
I would add to what Rory said about the court system. It's not just, I have a colleague, friend named Ben Liebman, who is analyzing those millions of cases. But they also did what I think is, because the opinions are worthless if they're not good judicial opinions. But what they've done is they took the financing of courts from the local level, where the local government and the local party totally controlled the courts, and put the financing up at the provincial level, which gave the courts, the judges at the local level, much more independence. But I think, Rory, I think you probably agree that in politically sensitive cases, which is very difficult to decide. Is pollution a politically sensitive case or not? Certainly something like the Falun Gong religion or Muslim activism or something would be sensitive. But those cases are still politically dealt with. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, and I would say that it's important not to overstate liberalization. So, the courts are under the control of the party. So any outcome that the party doesn't want or local party officials don't want would never come to pass. 99.999% of Chinese criminal defendants are found guilty. So there's really no such thing as if you're in the Chinese criminal justice system, you're found guilty. So there's certainly a lot of authoritarian components to it. But I was just trying to highlight an example where things have gotten a slight touch better than they were.
Yeah, I would just say to that, the statistic about Japanese defendants is 99%. If you look at the definition of trials, conviction rates, what happens to people who are arrested on their way to indictment, the American rate of conviction is well over 97 or at least 95% too. So when Carlos Ghosn escaped from Japan, I was enlisted by people to try to explain the 99%, and it's impossible because once the 99% statistic about Japanese conviction rates gets out, it's like trying to catch a rabbit.
Should we convert this? Should we convert it into the?
Yeah, about another 30 seconds for the poll. I'll close the poll out and then we'll convert it. The Democratic thought, Rory, was how the Chinese use vote garnering in the UN and other world bodies by influence buying, and they've become strategic about doing that. We could say we do as well, but they've really become strategic about buying third world influence.
Yeah, no, I think I missed that part of the question. I would agree with that. And I would say that they've been able to brand themselves as sort of the protector of like China maintains that it is a developing country. And so it has a natural coalition among other developing countries, even though it is a middle income country. So I think that's one of the ways that they're able to build this coalition.
So as you're closing out the survey, there are the poll results. Thank you. Thank everybody for getting involved in that.
You had Ice Gruber come before me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, this has got to be a huge.
He was warming up for you.
This is
it's like the lesser comedian comes on before the.
He was the opening act. While we're waiting to convert this over, people want to orally ask some questions now. We'll do that in a second. And Tom will explain that. But we have a question from John Claster about what do you think of the Epoch Times newspaper?
Oh, right.
So the Epoch Times is a outlet that is, I believe, correct me if anybody knows differently, is backed by the Falun Gong, which is a religious spiritual group that was widely persecuted in China in the 2000s. And it's a media outlet that is quite hostile to the Chinese Communist Party. There was an era where they had some decent reporting. It was sort of a dissident's view of China. I personally don't read it. I think I think we're involved in spreading a little bit of misinformation around COVID. And so they target people. Like I receive ads from the Epoch Times all the time. But I would say if you're looking for good coverage on China, I wouldn't, I would kind of stick to the usual suspects. I wouldn't go to the Epoch Times. I think they're a little bit unreliable.
If you want to participate verbally, raise your hand and I'll recognize you. I think Tom Tillerson has raised his hand, and I'm going to allow Tom to talk.
Tom's on mute.
Okay, you have to unmute Tom if you want to talk. Now we got a bunch of other hands that have been raised as well.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. I joined this meeting because I'm scared to death of where we're going with all this stuff. I've been working in China since 2004. Currently have a pharmaceutical research company in Shanghai. But I've been blocked from going back there ever since the COVID stuff. And the problem, I think, is that when you think of China, there are three universes you have to think of. One, and the one that gets all the attention, is the politics. Two is the economics, which gets some attention but isn't mainstream media. And then three is the Chinese people themselves. The relationship, as Frank had mentioned, one of the unfortunate side effects of the current situation is Asian people are being discriminated against and have all kinds of ill will being thrown at them. But at the end of the day, those three universes all have to work together or something changes. And what's going on right now is the politics side is becoming, as we've mentioned and as everybody has observed, is becoming much more authoritarian, much more restrictive. The China that I used to love and work in is not there anymore. And the problem is that if the systems don't all work together, at the end of the day, there's 1.4 billion people that need a job, that have life expectancies, that need to make a living, that have ambitions and dreams and are entrepreneurial. To the extent that the current politics over there allows them to achieve that, then the politics goes where it's going to go, and there's nothing we can do about it. To the extent that it stops working, and the 1.4 billion people see a reversal in the optimism that they've enjoyed for the last 20 years, there's going to be unrest in China. And I don't know if that's, I haven't seen it yet. The people on the street are still, they're not interested they're not interested in political change. They're interested in having their lives and their dreams being able to be fulfilled. So I guess the question becomes, to what extent are those three legs not working together, and to what extent might that be the solution that, refer back to one of the other questions, Japanizes China over the next 10 years. And if the answer to that is maybe yes, then one of the worst things that I'm afraid that we can do is just focus on the politics, make it a Cold War, maybe even explode into a real war, and that's going to be, really disastrous for the world.
I think that's a great question. And I would say, I think it's important for the US to accept that we actually probably have very little control as to how things play out in domestic China. And I think if you look back at some of the motivation for the trade war, there's advisors around President Trump, like Peter Navarro is a name you might want to look up, that tended to believe that the Communist Party is fragile and maybe even on the brink of collapse. And all it's going to take is a little bit of twisting that would unleash potentially this like a revolutionary type event. I personally think that the Communist Party, you would know probably better than I do if you've lived in China since 2004. I think the Communist Party has a pretty darn deep reservoir of support. And that support, might be a product of political education and indoctrination, but it's support nonetheless. And I don't think, people often will make these pronouncements like, this is going to be China's Chernobyl. This is going to be the moment that really changes how people think about the Communist Party and wants them to have a political alternative. But that people said that about COVID. When COVID first happened in China, there were probably 15 op-eds that said, this is the end of the Communist Party. Instead, what we're seeing is the Communist Party is sort of taking a victory lap right now. And if anything, the coronavirus crisis has enhanced the legitimacy of the Communist Party, would be my assertion. So I think in theory, yeah. So
I would
so
I would suggest that COVID has made things much worse.
I think it's made things worse on the ground.
By shutting all over, because prior to COVID, you had thousands of people, both business and civilians, going back and forth, which gave some level of consistency to messaging back and forth. Since travel's been cut off and we can't go there, they can't come here, all sides are basically have a free rein to say whatever they want to their people to enhance their message. And I see the rhetoric since COVID over here in the US just it's orders of magnitude more aggressive than it was pre-COVID. And I understand that in China, it's also the same thing. So that the COVID seems to be advancing this advance towards a Cold War situation faster than anybody dreamed the thing could advance.
Yeah, and I would just finish the thought and say, I think you're right. So COVID has created a political opportunity for both President Trump and Xi Jinping, and both are benefiting from fomenting nationalism and blame of the other side. So there's a non-trivial conspiracy theory in China that COVID was actually planted by the U.S. government, and I don't know what percentage of people believe in it, but it's a non-trivial percentage, and that narrative was allowed to fester much longer than it should have in mainland China. And on the US side, of course, we have narratives that this escaped from a Chinese lab and was potentially a bioweapon and so forth, and it's the Chinese virus. And so I would say, both political leaders, both political parties are benefiting from fomenting this sort of new Cold War. And I think, just to end on a slightly optimistic note, it is normal people, business people, academics, reporters, students, that sort of society to society linkage, which will hopefully pull things back a little bit from the brink. And you're right that COVID has basically evaporated that linkage, and it will eventually resume, hopefully in a year or two. So that's maybe our course for optimism. I would say that one organization I admire on this front is the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, which has long done the very hard work of just promoting person-to-person engagement between Chinese officials, U.S. officials, members of Chinese society, U.S. society. And I do think that type of relationship matters. Princeton also has a history of doing this. Princeton in Asia, which some of you are probably familiar with, has long sent students to Asia to facilitate that type of exchange. So I think I share your pessimism, but I'm hoping it's a 6-month blip and not a longer term descent into a new Cold War.
Just elevated Hobie Birmingham, if he would like to speak.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
I was just curious if you see any opportunities. You described it sort of a downward spiral in the CCP in terms of the direction towards one person rule. I mean, do you see any opportunities or any counter movements to sort of go back to the more collegial style that characterized China in the 1990s and 2000s that you were talking about? I mean, it seemed to me that they were on a much more constructive path during that time period. And is there any feeling that, that going back to that might, at least among some circles, might be more beneficial for the country than the direction they're in now, or is that just wishful thinking?
I think it would require leadership change on both sides. And by both sides, I mean the US and China, or at the very least on one side. Because right now, I don't see a world in which the US relationship with China really appreciably goes in the right direction, given the nature of who's advising President Trump and just the tenor of his rhetoric. And then the Chinese side, what do we know? What do we know about Xi Jinping is that he has an authoritarian impulse and a nationalist, aggressive, assertive impulse. And so I just don't see him changing course. We don't quite know what's going on at the elite levels of the Chinese Communist Party. What I do hear is that this, there is a cost to Xi personally from all of this, and that he has the general mantra of the Communist Party for a long time was always to basically keep your head down and bide your time. So the rise of China should be peaceful and sort of unobtrusive. Yeah. And Xi Jinping is obtrusive, and he's begat a global backlash against China, and it's happened within the 5-year period. And he's leaving China globally in a much worse position, arguably, than his predecessor. And so maybe that creates within the Communist Party a coalition to push back against the sort of hardline, aggressive foreign policy. Now, the question is, does that coalition, is that real? Do they exist? And are they going to be able to mount a challenge to his power? The period of time we should be looking to is 2022, when he is slated to step down, at least according to party norms. I think there are power struggles ongoing in the Communist Party that we can't observe. So that would be the only scenario if we got kind of a refresh with Chinese leadership. People used to always make fun of Hu Jintao as being this sort of bland, technocratic bookworm. But he was a person that the US government felt comfortable working with.
Yes.
And I do not get the sense that Xi Jinping is, although we hear that Xi Jinping and President Trump actually have a very cordial relationship and they talk on the phone frequently. This is what I've heard. So
it
could all just be rhetoric but I mean, that might be one force for stability, is both governments are playing up the rhetoric, but in reality, things are maybe more stable than they might seem. But I do think it's going to take a change in leadership.
Okay, I've opened up the line for 3 other classmates. If you wish to speak, go for it.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
This may be a silly question, but given what we know about COVID-19, particularly in New York and New Jersey, in terms of what's happened, the Chinese numbers just seem unbelievable, no matter how much control they have over the population of Wuhan. Are they as suspicious as they seem to be, in terms of what happened there and their ability to control and keep it and keep the supposed casualties so low?
So I'm not an epidemiologist, but I would say that most China watchers don't believe many numbers coming out of China. And in fact, like Li Keqiang, who's the current number 2 behind Xi Jinping, has famously said that GDP is a man-made number and he doesn't trust it. He doesn't trust China's own GDP numbers, and he relies on things like freight and electricity production to gauge economic growth in different parts of the country. So there's a widespread numbers problem in China, which is what happens when you incentivize lower level officials on these performance targets. They have an incentive to fake their data, and then you aggregate it up and we don't know quite what to believe. I would say, I think COVID data everywhere is bad. I mean, even in the United States, across different states and cities, I think nobody really knows much of anything. But I think the data from China, I agree, is completely suspect. Like there was some announcement, I think it was 6 or 7 weeks ago, that there were no more COVID cases in China. And it's unbelievable. It's just not a credible number. And I think that's what you get when you tell people that you're telling lower level officials that they must eliminate COVID, and lo and behold, they eliminate COVID. So I think it's still going. I think you hear stories of outbreaks in different parts of the country now. I think China is not immune to biology, but I think the broader narrative that, if I had to say, has China had fewer deaths from COVID than the United States? I think that the sort of broader trends are probably true, although the specific numbers might not be so good. Does that make sense? I don't know.
Yes, thank you.
Joel or Colin?
So this is Colin. I have a question about Korea. And what, if any, leverage we might expect China to exert to mollify the North Korean aggressive stance?
So we are moving increasingly far away from my areas of expertise, but that will not stop me from talking. So I'm not a Korea expert, but I think the one thing I've found surprising over the last couple of years as I've started to learn about it is that I think we often assume, North Korea is China's only treaty ally. So China doesn't have a systematic alliance system. Its only treaty ally is North Korea. And for that reason, people often assume that basically North Korea is the little brother and China can basically dictate what goes on and in some sense might be behind things like the nuclear testing and so forth. I think that was my presumption as an outsider for a long time. I think that presumption is misguided. And in fact, the leverage that China has over North Korean politics is probably a lot less than we might think. And there's an active effort by the Kim regime to distance itself from mainland China. There's, I think, a lot of distrust and antipathy among North Koreans towards China because they view it as paternalistic. And so I think China wants stability in the Korean Peninsula just as much as we do. I think their version of stability might look a little bit different than what we would like. But I think their capacity to sort of pull the strings might be less than we might think. Didn't get all the way there, but I maybe said something remotely intelligent.
A quick question along those lines. There was the question raised of Sino-Tibet relationships after what's recently happened with, between those two entities.
Okay, so I mean, I would say Sino-Tibet. Tibet is part of China. It's
with the Dalai Lama and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, and I think this is another delicate issue because there's a tendency, certainly in the U.S. and often among Hollywood celebrities, to say things like free Tibet. There is no world in which Tibet is independent of the People's Republic of China. The Communist Party would never, ever let that happen. And so I think it's important in some sense to put that policy option sort of out of our heads because I just don't think it's feasible. And I think saying things like that reveals a certain ignorance of the political reality. I think what you hear is that a lot of the draconian, so much of our attention now is on Xinjiang and what's happening to the Uyghur population. But there's some evidence that a lot of the control tactics that are being used among Uyghurs might be used among other ethnic minority populations. And that would be, so Tibet hasn't seen like the large scale re-education and mass incarceration campaigns that we've observed in Xinjiang, but it's quite possible that things can move in that direction. So I think that's something we should be keeping an eye out for. But yeah, Tibet has oddly fallen a little bit off the radar given what we've observed in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. But it's all part of the same question, which is how does the Chinese government control areas that don't necessarily want its control and populations that don't necessarily view themselves as Chinese. And often under Xi Jinping, they've turned to authoritarian tools, control, repression, surveillance, where I would argue that actually a softer touch, lending more towards autonomy might get them farther in the long run.
Tom, should we wrap this up with Joel and Jeff?
Yes.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Rory, this is Joel. I would ask you to look into your crystal ball on the issue of how political change can take place in China from where we are now to a softer version of the party, something like what we used to have before Xi Jinping, or perhaps something more radical change. And there's always been factionalism in the Chinese Communist Party. Xi Jinping has reduced it, but it still exists under the surface. We don't know how much, we don't know who. There are people who are guessing about that. But what would it take? And then there are other potential sources of opposition to the regime. Business, which has generally tried to avoid taking a political stand because they'd lose, but they have money, they have thoughts, and other entities that might oppose the regime or argue for something better. What is it going to take in terms of economic change internally, driven by a bad economy, excessive debt, excessive manufacturing capacity, no one to sell to, or other events like U.S. Pressure, do you see any scenario for China to evolve beyond Xi Jinping and into something that is easier for us to live with?
That's a good question, and a good question to end on, maybe. I think it's important to remember that there's a certain cyclical nature to Chinese politics. So if you look at the long arc of the history of the Chinese Communist Party, there's always these periods of darkness and repression and hyper-authoritarianism that give way to periods of relative liberalism. So we had the darkness of the Cultural Revolution giving way to Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s, a relative openness that then gave way to Tiananmen, which led into a period of closeness, which then gave us Hu Jintao, which was actually relatively open, and now we're under Xi Jinping and it's relatively repressive. So there is this sort of cyclical back and forth nature. And so Xi Jinping, he won't be in power forever, and I would expect, I was talking to some of my Chinese students, you know, when Xi Jinping consolidated power and eliminated the term limit, they were largely saddened by it, but a few of them said something along the lines of, well, maybe this will galvanize a coalition on the other side and create a moment, a political moment for someone who is slightly more liberal to gain power someday. When that day is, it's hard to tell. I think if I were Xi Jinping, I would be pretty worried right now. I don't think China is out of the woods on COVID, both in terms of the biology and the epidemiology, but also in terms of the economy. And a major global recession coupled with Cold War weather coming from the United States, leading up to 2022, when there's supposed to be a leadership turnover, that could create a sort of perfect storm where at the very least, it might be difficult for him to get everything that he wants. I don't know if that will be the case, but that would be, I think the next 2 years are potentially a moment for change. But even if not, eventually he will pass away. There's discussion that he has health problems. So eventually we're going to see someone other than Xi Jinping. And, you know, what's interesting, like Deng Xiaoping came to power actually through a coup d'etat. So he was not Mao's chosen successor. Mao's chosen successor, Hua Guofeng, lacked legitimacy within the party. He was so weak that he was easily overturned. And so Xi Jinping, even if he leaves office, he's going to anoint some patsy. And maybe that person isn't quite strong enough to maintain things, and that could create a possibility for an opening and someone to lead China in a different direction. But this is deep into the crystal ball. But I guess that's a good way to end this kind of talk.
Jeff, do you have a quick question?
Yeah, just real quick, Rory. I read last year Howard French's book, Everything Under the Heavens. Are you familiar with that?
I don't actually think I've read that book. I apologize. That's my
okay. I found it's a history of China up to around 2018. And he pointed out several weaknesses that China has that if the US engaged properly by working with allies, China has 15 countries that surround it on its borders. So it's always been somewhat, not necessarily paranoid like the Soviets, but it's a problem for them. They have a terrible demographics issue coming up with their one-child policy, leaving this hangover so that economically it's going to be very, very difficult. And that their global ambitions, he felt, were more contained to what this geographic or historical range of influence that he refers to as the 9-dash line. Is that a terminology that fits with your background? So that his thinking was that the US, it's going to take time, but through like the TPP or large economic alliances, we can contain China to certain behaviors if we build that coalition. He did publish because China's got a time problem. They're going to have this issue with their demographics. So they have to be economically strong. They're not going to be if we chose to work together. Of course, he then put an epilogue out when the paperback edition came out that said, with the president-elect of Donald Trump, he's now worried because we don't do coalitions. So any last thought on his sense of how to contain the China?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I would say so there's a tendency among some people in the United States to want to basically slow or reverse China's rise. And I think the reality is it's inevitable, you know, and if China overtakes us in terms of GDP, by some measures it already has, but, you know, militarily, economically, China will be larger than the United States sometime in the future. And if that happens, you know, 10 years later, then it could. I don't know if that's really the right way to think about the problem. I think it's more about shaping China's rise, accepting it as reality, preparing for a bipolar world, and shaping China's rise such that it feels less threatened and is less aggressive, but also is willing to work within the institutions that the United States has built and maintained. And I think that final point is important, which is that we must continue to work within the institutions that we've set up and abdicating responsibility in things like the UN Human Rights Council or things like the Paris Agreement. Like, we need to be actively engaged in the institutions we've created and work to, you know, people used to use the words responsible stakeholder. That's what the goal was for China. People don't use that language anymore, but I do think it's still possible that we can encourage China not to remake the world, but to join it and participate. And I think that is possible. But I think this idea of derailing China and hoping that they falter, I think that's unrealistic. And I think it's also that kind of zero-sum thinking. You know, a strong, healthy China, a good economy in China is good for the United States, provided that it doesn't present a security risk. And so I think that's how I've been thinking about it, at least.
I think his main point was just that the bending of China to more of the international norms would be a lot easier if the international did it as a group.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You know, I think, and it requires kind of careful multilateralism and things like
Thank
the TPP. Yeah, absolutely.
So I hear the bell on top of Nassau Hall ringing. On behalf of the class, I want to thank you, Professor Truex, very much for this agreeing to be with this webinar. It's been terrific. We knew it would be. I want to remind classmates that we have some great webinars coming up. We're going to do them on a monthly basis, probably. We have them on artificial intelligence and medicine. We have them on climate change. We have one on sports, and we have one on engineering and entrepreneurial studies. So we have some very interesting things coming up. Stay tuned. I and the committee will try to keep you informed. Thanks very much for joining us today. And thank you all, Frank, Rory, and Tom. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Rory.
Stay safe.